In the middle decades of the 19th century, when America still felt like a land of unfinished promises, a young man named Hannes Tiedemann stood on the deck of a steamer and watched the low shoreline of a new world rise from the Atlantic haze. He was born in 1832 on the island of Rügen, a windswept patch of land in the Baltic Sea that then belonged to Prussia. Life there was hard, the soil thin, the winters long. But Hannes carried something more valuable than money or land, a restless intelligence and a conviction that the world could be bent to a man's will if he worked without complaint. He arrived in Cleveland sometime in the 1850s. The exact year varies slightly in records, carrying little beyond change of clothes, a few coins, and the engineering and commercial knowledge he had acquired back home. Cleveland at that moment was a city on fire with possibility. The Great Lakes had turned into a gateway between the iron ranges of the upper Midwest and the factories of the East. Railroads snaked outward in every direction. Smoke from steel mills and refineries stained the sky. Men who had been nobody a decade earlier now walked the streets with the confidence of kings. Hannes saw opportunity the way a carpenter sees uncut timber, raw, abundant, waiting to be shaped. He began in the wholesale grocery trade, a business that demanded sharp arithmetic, reliable suppliers, and the ability to read people quickly. He learned English on the job, mastered the rhythms of American commerce, and proved himself dependable in a city full of risk-takers. By 1864, at age 32, he had risen high enough to become a partner in the firm of Votow and Tiedemann. The partnership thrived. Hannes earned a reputation, not just for profit, but for fairness. He paid his workers decent wages when many employers squeezed every penny. He honored contracts even when the market turned against him. Among Cleveland's growing German community, he became known as a man who remembered where he came from. He contributed to cultural societies, helped new arrivals find housing and work, and quietly loaned money to those starting over in a strange land. Somewhere in those busy years, he met Louise. The historical record is frustratingly silent on the details of their courtship. No preserved letters, no newspaper announcements of engagement. What is clear is that their marriage became the steady center of his life. Louise was practical, strong-willed, and every bit as ambitious for their future as Hannes himself. Together they started a family. Children arrived one after another. Emma in 1865, August a few years later, Dora, and several others whose brief lives would later be measured in gravestones rather than years. Hannes, however, refused to remain a grocer forever. He understood something fundamental about wealth in the Gilded Age. Real power came not from selling goods, but from controlling the flow of money itself. In 1883, he helped found the Cleveland Savings and Trust Company, one of the first institutions chartered in Ohio under new state laws that allowed trust companies to operate. As vice president, he handled the account of Cleveland's wealthiest families, industrialists, bankers, railroad men. He moved among men who owned steel mills and lake freighters. He sat at tables where millions changed hands over brandy and cigars. In less than 2 decades, he had climbed from a penniless immigrant to one of the city's financial elite. Wealth like that demanded expression. In Gilded Age America, success was not private. It was architectural. On the east side of the city, Euclid Avenue had become famous as Millionaire's Row, lined with marble palaces built by Rockefeller, Hanna, and Mather. But Franklin Boulevard on the west side had emerged as the preferred address for Cleveland's prosperous German-American community. Quieter, more dignified, yet no less grand. The Tiedemanns had already owned property along Franklin Boulevard since the late 1860s. They lived in a comfortable but unremarkable house at the address. For Hannes, that was no longer enough. He did not want a larger home. He wanted a monument. He envisioned a residence that would announce, without a single word, that the boy from Rügen had arrived at the summit of American life. A house that spoke of permanence, of legacy, of triumph over every obstacle fate had placed in his path. He wanted, in short, a castle. To make it real, he turned to the best architectural firm in the city, Cudell and Richardson. The lead partner, Frank Cudell, was himself a German immigrant who had arrived in America young and worked his way up through sheer talent and tenacity. The two men understood one another instinctively. Hannes explained his vision, a 4-story mansion of rock-faced sandstone, dominated by a round corner tower that would be visible for blocks. The style would blend the asymmetry and textured richness of Queen and with the brooding verticality of German Gothic, a building that felt both American and old world at once. Plans were drawn. In 1881, construction began. Workers swarmed the site. Masons laid massive foundation stones. Carpenters framed interior walls. The round tower began to rise, its curves demanding precision that only the most skilled could deliver. Red brick trim appeared around every window, creating sharp contrast against the gray stone. Along the roofline, grotesque gargoyles took shape, protective figures in medieval tradition, though later generations would see something more sinister in their carved faces. Hannes walked the site daily, sometimes with Louise at his side. He pointed out where the grand parlor would host Cleveland's business elite, where the children would have their bedrooms, where sunlight would pour through tall windows. He spoke of the future. Grandchildren running through the halls, holidays celebrated in rooms lit by gas chandeliers. The Tiedemann name carried forward for generations. For a few years, everything seemed possible. The castle rose steadily toward completion. The family prepared to move in. The American dream, in Hannes Tiedemann's hands, looked almost complete. What he could not foresee, what no one could foresee, was how quickly that dream would begin to fracture. The house that was meant to stand as proof of success would soon become something far darker, a place where hope and grief collided so violently that the collision would echo for more than a century. Hannes Tiedemann did not choose his architect lightly. In the early 1880s, Cleveland's skyline and streetscape were being reshaped by the firm of Cudell and Richardson, the city's most respected architectural partnership. Frank Cudell, born in Germany in 1844, had arrived in America as a young man and risen through determination and skill, much like Tiedemann himself. Partner John Richardson complemented him with technical precision. Together, they had already left their mark on Cleveland. Soaring churches like St. Stephen Roman Catholic Church and Franklin Circle Christian Church, buildings praised for lasting craftsmanship and bold design. Their reputation was built on structures meant to endure centuries, not just seasons. When Tiedemann approached them, he brought a clear vision and the resources to realize it. He wanted more than luxury. He wanted a residence that rivaled the grandest homes on Euclid Avenue's Millionaires Row, yet reflected the German-American sensibility of Franklin Boulevard's quieter prestige. The architects delivered a design in the High Victorian eclectic style, often described as Queen and in an American form, characterized by asymmetry, varied textures, rich decorative details, and a sense of picturesque complexity. Yet they infused it with Gothic echoes that evoked the castles of the old country, vertical emphasis, a commanding presence, and almost fortress-like solidity. Construction commenced in 1881 on the lot at 4308 Franklin Boulevard. The cornerstone was laid with deliberate ceremony, as if marking the beginning of a dynasty. Workers, masons, carpenters, stonecutters descended on the site in all weather. The foundation was set deep with massive blocks of rock-faced sandstone quarried for durability and dramatic texture. Course by course, the gray stone walls climbed, their rough surfaces catching light and shadow in ways that made the building appear alive, watchful. The standout feature was the round corner tower, rising from the northwest angle like a sentinel. Its masonry required exceptional skill. The curves had to be perfect, the stones keyed tightly to resist settling or cracking over time. Atop the tower sat a conical roof, sharp against the Cleveland sky, visible from blocks away, and giving the house its unmistakable silhouette. Turrets pierced the main roofline elsewhere, adding vertical drama. Along the eaves, stone gargoyles were mounted, grotesque figures drawn from medieval tradition, intended as guardians against evil spirits. In daylight they looked ornamental. At dusk, their shadowed faces took on a more ominous cast. The facade was punctuated by nearly 80 windows, tall, narrow on some elevations, arched or bayed on others, flooding the interior with natural light, while creating an exterior that seemed to observe the street. Deep brick red trim framed every opening, providing vivid contrast against the pale sandstone and emphasizing the building's eclectic character. The overall scale was imposing. For full stories, plus attic space, with an estimated 21 to 30 rooms depending on how service areas and later additions were counted. The layout was ingenious. Formal parlors and dining rooms for entertaining Cleveland's business elite on the lower floors, family bedrooms above, and flexible spaces that could be closed off to serve as private quarters for newly arrived German immigrants. Tiedemann never forgot his own early hardships. He designed a house to function not just as a private home, but as a place of temporary refuge for others starting over in America. Inside, the craftsmanship matched the exterior's ambition. Carpenters framed intricate staircases that wound through multiple levels. Plasterers prepared walls for ornate moldings and ceiling medallions. Gas fixtures were installed throughout, promising warm, steady light. Hidden passages, service corridors, back staircases, and storage spaces typical of large Victorian homes, threaded behind the walls, allowing servants to move unseen. Some of these would later fuel rumors of secret chambers, though they were built for practicality, not mystery. The work pressed on through 1881 and 1882. Neighbors on Franklin Boulevard watched the castle rise with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. It dwarfed nearby homes, its tower piercing the skyline like a declaration. Tiedemann visited the site almost daily, sometimes with Louise beside him. They walked among the scaffolding, pointing out where the grand parlor would host dinners, where sunlight would stream into the children's rooms, where the fourth-floor ballroom would one day span the full length of the house. He spoke of legacy. This was not merely shelter, but a monument to what an immigrant could achieve through hard work and vision. By late 1882 or early 1883, sources vary slightly on the exact move-in date. The major construction was complete. The family stepped across the threshold into rooms still scented with fresh plaster, varnish, and sawdust. Furniture was arranged. Curtains hung at the tall windows. Gas lights flickered to life. Children's laughter echoed to the empty halls as August and Dora explored their new domain. Emma, already gone by then, would never see it finished. For that brief season, the house felt like fulfillment. Sunlight poured through those 80 windows, warming the stone. The round tower stood sentinel. The gargoyles kept watch. Everything Tiedemann had labored for, the climb from rugged to riches, the partnerships, the trust company, the family he had built, now had a physical form, solid, enduring, proud. The castle was ready to receive life, to host celebrations, to shelter generations. No one yet suspected how swiftly that promise would darken, how the very walls meant to protect would soon absorb grief instead of joy. The monument was complete. The tragedy was only beginning. The castle was still unfinished when the first shadow fell. In January 1881, while masons were still laying the final courses of sandstone and carpenters hammered railings into place, 15-year-old Emma Tiedemann lay dying in the family's temporary home on Franklin Boulevard. The diagnosis was diabetes mellitus, in the medical language of the day, sugar diabetes. There was no insulin, no way to regulate blood glucose, no realistic hope of recovery. Treatment amounted to starvation diets, herbal concoctions, and prayer. The body, unable to process sugar, consumed itself. Emma weakened steadily. Exhaustion, relentless thirst, wasting flesh, blurred vision. She understood what was happening. She had watched her father's business climb, had seen the blueprints for the magnificent house rising just blocks away. She knew she would never live in it. Emma died on January 21st, 1881, before a single room in the completed castle had been occupied. Her body was prepared and buried in Riverside Cemetery. She never crossed the threshold of the home her father had built as a monument to their future. That single fact would later matter greatly when ghost stories began to circulate. If the crying girl in white, seen decades afterward, was meant to be Emma's spirit, bound to a house she never entered, the timeline refused to cooperate. Legends, however, are seldom troubled by chronology. For Hannes and Louise, the loss was immediate and brutal. Their eldest daughter, bright on the cusp of womanhood, was gone at an age when most parents still dream of weddings and grandchildren. They buried her in winter earth while the castle's tower continued to rise behind them. Grief entered the family like damp rot, silent at first, then spreading. The house was not yet ready, but death did not wait for completion. Shortly after Emma's funeral, Hannes's mother, Louise Tiedemann, passed away within the walls of the new mansion. She had crossed the Atlantic years earlier to witness her son's success in America. Her death, though expected in old age, felt cruelly timed. 2 funerals in close succession. 2 graves side by side in Riverside Cemetery. 2 absences echoing through rooms still smelling of fresh plaster. Construction pressed forward. More stone was set. Windows were glazed. The gargoyles took their places along the eaves. By late 1882 or early 1883, the family moved in. August and Dora, the surviving children at that point, ran through the echoing halls. Louise managed the household. Hannes returned to his office at the Savings and Trust Company. There were moments, perhaps evenings when gaslight softened the grand parlor, or mornings when sunlight streamed through the tall windows, when the house felt warm, alive, promising. But Emma's chair remained empty at the table. Every birthday without her, every holiday, every ordinary afternoon carried her absence like a weight. The family tried to move forward. They had no choice. Yet the shadow lingered in every corridor, waited in every unused bedroom, and asked a question no one dared speak aloud. Was this only the beginning? It was not. Between 1886 and 1888, 3 more Tiedemann children died inside Franklin Castle. The exact names and ages vary slightly in different accounts, but the pattern is unmistakable. 3 young lives extinguished in the span of roughly 2 years. The causes were illnesses tragically common in the late 19th century: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, pneumonia, whooping cough. Childhood mortality was still high. Every parent knew that not all children would reach adulthood. Vaccines and antibiotics lay decades in the future. Doctors could do little beyond palliative care and watchful waiting. Still, even by the grim standards of the 1880s, the concentration of deaths in one household felt excessive. 1 teenager loss to diabetes could be explained as bad luck. An elderly grandmother's passing was natural. But 5 children gone, 4 of them young, within a decade, all under the same roof? Neighbors began to murmur. Perhaps something in the house itself was to blame. Bad drainage, contaminated well water, poor ventilation trapping miasma. Or perhaps it was something less rational. Fate, a curse, a malevolent atmosphere that clung to the stones. Hannes's response was telling. Even as he buried child after child, he could not stop altering the house. He hired workers to add more windows, letting in extra light. He reconfigured rooms, tearing out walls and building new ones. Additions appeared. Sections were demolished and rebuilt differently. The sound of hammers and saws became almost constant on Franklin Boulevard. From one perspective, this compulsion makes sense. Grief can drive people emotion to control something when so much has slipped beyond reach. Rearranging stone and plaster may have been Hannes's way of fighting helplessness. To those watching from across the street, however, the endless remodeling looked obsessive, almost frantic. The house was never allowed to settle. It remained in a state of perpetual change. As though it could only find the perfect arrangement of rooms, the deaths would stop. They did not stop. Yet life persisted, fragile and stubborn. 2 children, August and Dora, survived the dangerous early years. They grew into adolescence, then adulthood. They married. They gave Hannes and Louise 6 grandsons, all healthy boys who lived long enough to carry the family name into the 20th century. There were weddings celebrated in the grand rooms. There were holidays when grandchildren raced through the halls. For a few hours at a time, laughter could still be heard beneath the high ceilings. But the dead were never far away. Their absences were carved into the hearts of those who remained. And in the house itself, in the walls Hannes kept moving, the windows he kept adding, the spaces he kept reshaping. Something had shifted. Franklin Castle was no longer merely a symbol of immigrant triumph. It had become a place marked by death, a residence where tragedy had visited so frequently that it seemed to have claimed permanent residence. The neighbors' whispers never entirely ceased. The questions about what truly happened behind those sandstone walls never fully disappeared. And the shadow that first fell in January 1881 would stretch across the decades, growing darker with each retelling. Death had entered the castle before the family ever truly settled in, and it was far from finished. Hannes Tiedemann walked away from Franklin Castle in 1896, leaving behind the sandstone walls that had witnessed too much sorrow. He sold the property to the Mulhauser family, a fellow German-American household, and retreated to his quieter summer home in Lakewood. There he remarried, continued his charitable work, and lived out his remaining years in relative peace until his death in 1908 at age 76. By then, the Tiedemann era had ended. His surviving children, August and Dora, passed in 1906, and no direct heirs remained to claim the mansion or its legacy. For the next quarter century, Franklin Castle passed through a series of private owners. Records are sparse on the exact sequence, but the house changed hands several times. Occupied briefly by a widow from Virginia, then by a prominent local physician, and others who treated it as a grand but ordinary residence. On the surface, it remained what it had always been, a distinguished Victorian mansion on a prestigious boulevard, architecturally significant and respectable. No major scandals or tragedies were recorded during these years. The castle simply endured, its rooms filled and emptied by new families, its towers still watching over Franklin Boulevard. Then, in 1921, the house found a new and enduring purpose. The Bildungsverein Eintracht, a German singing and cultural society, purchased the property and transformed it into a vibrant community hub. Renamed Eintracht Hall, it served for the next 47 years, 1921 to 1968, as the headquarters of what became known as the German-American League for Culture. This ethnic organization celebrated German traditions, language, music, and social ties in the New World. In its early decades, the League engaged in political causes. Later, it functioned primarily as a German singing club, Gesangverein, hosting concerts, dances, meetings, and performances in the same grand parlors and ballroom where the Tiedemann children had once played. The transition was fitting in many ways. Hannes Tiedemann himself had been a pillar of Cleveland's German immigrant community, generous with aid, active in cultural organizations. Now his castle became a literal gathering place for that same community. Choir rehearsals filled the halls with harmony. Dances brought laughter and music to the rooms that had once echoed with grief. Social events drew families together under the high ceilings. For nearly half a century, Eintracht Hall was a center of pride and continuity for German Americans in Cleveland, a living link to the old country amid the challenges of assimilation. Yet even during this respectable period, darker rumors began to take root. During Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, whispers circulated that the mansion's many rooms, hidden passages, and service corridors provided cover for illegal liquor production. The large, private structure, with its forgotten spaces and thick walls, allegedly concealed a secret distillery or storage for bootleg alcohol. No police raid or arrests were ever documented at the address, but the stories persisted, fed by the house's labyrinthine layout. World War II brought even more sinister speculation. Some claimed Eintracht Hall had become a meeting place for Nazi sympathizers or a hideout for German spies. One particularly lurid legend asserted that dozens of Nazi agents were captured and executed in the basement. These tales were baseless. No FBI records, no newspaper accounts, no credible evidence ever supported them. In reality, the German-American League for Culture took an anti-fascist stance before U.S. entry into the war. Some accounts note that anti-Nazi German communists even used the tower for shortwave radio broadcasts opposing Hitler's regime. The house's closed, ethnic character and its hidden architectural features, service staircases, sealed rooms discovered over time, made it easy for suspicion to flourish in an era of wartime paranoia. The rumors endured because the building invited them. Large Victorian homes like Franklin Castle often included back corridors, dumbwaiters, and storage spaces designed to keep servants and supplies out of sight. Over decades, as owners came and went, some of these areas were plastered over, forgotten, or sealed. Renovations occasionally uncovered hidden doors, narrow stairways, or small chambers accessible only through concealed panels. To a public already primed for intrigue, each discovery became proof of secrets. Hidden stills, spy radios, or worse. By the 1960s, Eintracht Hall's long stewardship was drawing to a close. The German-American League for Culture sold the property in 1968. The house that had served as a private family home, then a cultural beacon for nearly 5 decades, returned to private ownership. What followed would shift its identity forever. The respectable years of singing societies and community gatherings gave way to stories of a different kind. Tales no longer whisper among neighbors, but shouted in headlines and ghost tours. The castle's reputation as one of America's most haunted houses was about to be born. The building had survived the Tiedemann tragedies. It had thrived as a cultural center. Now it stood on the threshold of something new, a legend that would outgrow history itself. In January 1968, James Romano and his wife Lucretia purchased Franklin Castle with ambitious plans. They had 6 children and a vision: transform the grand ground floor spaces into a restaurant where Cleveland's West Side could gather for meals amid historic surroundings. The mansion's distinctive architecture, the round tower, the sandstone facade, the cavernous rooms, seemed perfect for drawing crowds. They saw potential, not peril. The trouble began almost the moment they moved in. On moving day, while James and Lucretia directed furniture placement downstairs, 2 of the Romano children ventured up to explore the mostly empty upper floors. The 3rd and 4th levels were dusty, awaiting renovation, their hallways echoing with footsteps. As the children ran from room to room, they encountered a little girl standing at the end of a corridor. She wore a white dress. She was crying, shoulders shaking, hands covering her face. No sound came from her sobs, only silent grief. One child called out, asking if she was hurt or needed help. The girl looked up and vanished. The children raced downstairs, breathless, insisting their mother come see. Lucretia climbed the stairs with them. The hallway was empty, silent, thick with dust. No girl, no footprints. She reassured them it was shadows, tricks of an old house. But she felt it too, a sudden coldness in the air, a pressure like being watched. The crying girl would appear again, always on upper floors, always weeping without sound. Over time, Lucretia came to believe she was seeing Emma Tiedemann, the 15-year-old who had died of diabetes before the castle was finished. The phenomena escalated quickly. Phantom organ music drifted through the house late at night. Full, practice chords from rooms that held no instrument. The family followed the sound, room to room, but found nothing. Heavy footfalls climbed the staircases when everyone was accounted for, slow, deliberate steps creaking on wooden treads, sometimes passing right beside them. Blankets were yanked off beds in the dark, ripped away with force while children slept. They woke cold and terrified. Cold spots materialized without reason. A warm hallway would lead into a room that felt like midwinter. Doors opened and closed on their own. Locked doors stood ajar in the morning. Sometimes the family watched the door swing slowly open while they stood directly in front of it. The sensation of being observed became constant, oppressive. Certain parts of the house grew so uncomfortable that family members avoided them entirely. One night stood out as particularly harrowing. Lucretia Romano woke on the bedroom floor, not in bed beside her husband, where she had fallen asleep, screaming without knowing why. Then she heard it. Another scream beside her, a woman's voice thick with anguish, rage, and terror. The sound stopped when her husband switched on the light, but the presence lingered for seconds after, heavy and close. She felt something wanted them gone. Another figure appeared repeatedly, a woman in black, standing motionless in upper-floor windows. Neighbors sometimes mistook her for a living resident. The Romanos caught glimpses and reflections or peripheral vision. Lucretia believed this was Louise Tiedemann, the wife who had buried 5 children, and her mother-in-law, then succumbed to liver disease herself. The woman in black seemed to watch Franklin Boulevard, still waiting, still trapped in place of her greatest losses. The family tried to press on. Renovations for the restaurant began. They invited a local paranormal research group to investigate, hoping for explanations. One investigator reportedly fled the house screaming. The experiences did not relent. They intensified. Desperate, James Romano called a Catholic priest. The priest arrived, walked the rooms, listened to the accounts. He sprinkled holy water, offered prayers. When he finished, he did not provide comfort. He looked at the family gravely and said words they would never forget. "This house is getting the best of you. You need to leave." He believed Franklin Castle was beyond ordinary blessing, that whatever resided there was too strong, too entrenched. The Romanos lasted until 1974. Roughly 6 years in a home they had entered with dreams of business and family life. The restaurant never opened. The renovations remained incomplete. They packed their belongings, locked the door, and left the castle empty once more. But their story did not stay private. The children spoke to friends. The priest confided in others about the house that needed more than he could give. Word spread through Cleveland's west side and beyond. For the first time, the hauntings were no longer quiet neighborhood whispers or private grief. They had contemporary witnesses, an ordinary family with no motive to invent tales, who had tried to live normally and been driven out by forces they could not explain. The castle stood silent again in the mid-1970s, waiting. Its reputation had shifted irreversibly. What had been a historic mansion, then a cultural hall, was now something else entirely in the public mind. One of America's most actively haunted houses. The next owner would not flee the stories. He would embrace them. The castle stood empty for only a short time after the Romanos left in 1974. In the mid-1970s, a new owner stepped forward who saw the property not as a burden to flee, but as an opportunity to exploit. His name was George Sam Muscatello. Unlike previous residents who had hoped the ghost stories were exaggerated or explainable, Muscatello recognized their commercial potential. He understood a fundamental truth about human curiosity. People will pay to experience fear when they know they can walk away unharmed. A house where an entire family had reportedly been driven out by genuine phenomena was far more compelling than any fabricated haunted attraction. Muscatello purchased Franklin Castle with a clear strategy. He would not deny or downplay the hauntings. He would amplify them. He would turn the mansion into Cleveland's premier destination for the paranormal curious. The Romano experiences were already circulating through local gossip and word of mouth. The Tiedemann family tragedies were documented historical fact. All he needed to do was open the doors, invite the public inside, and let the stories and the house itself do the rest. He began by welcoming local media with open arms. Reporters, radio hosts, television crews. Anyone with an audience was encouraged to visit, explore, and investigate. The approach was shrewd. If journalists found nothing unusual, the mystery would deepen. Why had so many others reported so much? If they encountered something strange, their credibility would lend weight to the claims. Either outcome kept Franklin Castle in the news. The media came, and many left with stories they could not easily dismiss. One of the most dramatic accounts came from John Webster, a well-known Cleveland radio personality. While recording inside the castle, something invisible seized his tape recorder and hurled it down a staircase. Webster stood at the top of the steps holding only the microphone, watching his equipment tumble and shatter on the landing below. He was an experienced broadcaster whose professional reputation depended on reliability and composure. Yet he insisted the incident was real, unexplainable, and genuinely frightening. Other reporters described passing through cold vapors that felt solid and deliberate. They heard footsteps, whispers, muffled crying from behind closed doors. They felt an emotional weight, dread, sadness, oppression, that pressed down in certain rooms. Muscatello began offering paid tours. Visitors walked to the grand parlors, climbed the staircases, peered into the tower. He guided them himself, recounting the Tiedemann deaths in careful detail, describing the Romano family's terror, pointing out hidden passages and sealed spaces. Guests claimed to see the woman in black standing in the tower window, her silhouette motionless against the glass, watching them from above. Some reported sudden temperature drops, the sensation of being touched, or the faint sound of a child crying far away. The tour succeeded. People came from Cleveland and farther afield, drawn by the promise of genuine history laced with authentic fear. Then in 1975, came the discovery that would forever cement the house's dark reputation. During renovation work, controlled by Muscatello, construction workers uncovered human bones sealed inside a hidden wall panel. Not a single fragment, but multiple bones, reportedly parts of a skeleton. The remains are described as very old, possibly a century or more, which replaced them in the Tiedemann era. The find made immediate headlines. Newspapers ran sensational stories. Television stations sent camera crews. Paranormal investigators declared Franklin Castle one of the most significant haunted sites in the United States. To many, the bones seemed to confirm the darkest legends, proof that Hannes Tiedemann had murdered someone. Perhaps the niece said to have been hanged in the attic, or the mistress strangled in the tower. The discovery appeared to explain everything. The concentration of family deaths, the aggressive phenomena, the Romano's flight. Murder left a stain deeper than grief. Suspicion fell on Muscatello almost instantly. The timing was too perfect. A man operating a haunted attraction suddenly discovers human remains during renovations he oversaw. The bones had supposedly been hidden for nearly 100 years, yet no previous owner, no prior renovation, no demolition had uncovered them. Skeptics theorized that Muscatello had planted the remains himself, purchased old bones from a medical supplier or antique source, concealed them in the wall, then staged a dramatic reveal to generate publicity and boost ticket sales. Was the theory accurate? No definitive proof has ever surfaced either way. No forensic analysis was publicly conducted on the bones, or if it was, the results were never released. The remains themselves disappeared from the historical record. They were not preserved for study, donated to a museum, or examined by anthropologists. They simply vanished, leaving only photographs, newspaper clippings, and conflicting accounts. The truth lies somewhere between two extremes: genuine historical remains accidentally uncovered, or a calculated hoax designed to sell fear. More than 50 years later, no conclusive evidence has settled the question. What is certain is the impact. The 1975 bone discovery transformed Franklin Castle's story permanently. It moved the narrative from tragic family home with reported hauntings to site of documented murder. The house became a national curiosity. Ghost hunters, journalists, and thrill seekers arrived in greater numbers. Muscatello's tours flourished for a time, but the business model eventually faltered. The mansion demanded constant, expensive maintenance, repairs to the aging roof, plumbing, electrical systems, and stonework. Income from tours could not keep pace with costs. The property changed hands again in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, passing through multiple owners who stayed only briefly before selling. By then, Franklin Castle had become larger than its physical structure. It was no longer just a building. It was a legend, a story told and retold, growing with each telling. The bones had given the tale a tangible centerpiece, whether real or manufactured. The house had entered its most infamous chapter, the era when fear was not merely experienced, but deliberately marketed. After the 1975 bone discovery and the peak of Sam Muscatello's ghost tours, Franklin Castle entered a turbulent decade. The promise of steady income from paranormal tourism proved fragile. The mansion's age demanded constant, costly repairs, leaking roofs, failing plumbing, cracked sandstone, outdated electrical systems. Tour revenue could not keep pace. By the late 1970s, Muscatello sold the property. It passed through several short-term owners, each staying only a few years before moving on. The castle's reputation as a haunted landmark grew, but its physical condition declined. Then came the first deliberate attempt to destroy it. In the early 1970s, before Muscatello's tours fully took off, before the bones were found, Cleveland police and fire departments responded to a call at 4308 Franklin Boulevard. When they arrived, they found not an accidental blaze, but a man inside the house methodically setting small fires in multiple rooms. Curtains smoldered, papers burned in corners. Furniture had been doused and ignited. The intruder had no connection to property. He did not live there, work there, or know the owners. He had simply walked in from the street and begun his work. When officers subdued and questioned him, his explanation was chilling and direct. "I had to burn down the castle because it was pure evil." He described feeling compelled, as though an external force had guided him to the address and directed his actions. He believed destroying the building was necessary to stop whatever malevolence resided within. The incident left an official record, police reports, fire department logs, an arrest. Unlike many of the castle's legends that rest on personal testimony, this event was documented. The man's mental state was almost certainly compromised, whether his convictions stemmed from delusion, from genuine perception of something dark, or from cultural knowledge of the house's growing reputation is impossible to determine. The fires were extinguished quickly. Damage was minimal. The castle survived. But the episode was prophetic. It suggested that Franklin Castle had begun to provoke reactions far beyond curiosity or fear, reactions that could turn violent. 29 years later, the threat returned in far more destructive form. In 1999, less than a year after Michael DeVinco, stage name Mickey Dean's, Judy Garland's last husband, sold the property, a major fire tore through the mansion. This time it was no small, scattered blaze. Flames consumed large sections of the interior, collapsing ceilings, charring wooden beams, and leaving entire rooms open to the sky. Blackened walls stood exposed. The round tower's conical roof was damaged. Smoke stains marred the sandstone facade. The investigation concluded what many suspected from the start: arson. Someone had deliberately set the fire. No suspect was ever publicly named, and no motive was definitively established. The blaze left Franklin Castle in real danger of total loss. For the first time in its history, the building that had endured family tragedies, cultural shifts, and decades of neglect faced the possibility of demolition. A new owner purchased the damaged property soon after and began investing heavily in restoration. Structural supports were reinforced. Charred timbers were replaced. The roof was patched. Walls were rebuilt. Work continued into the early 2000s with the goal of returning the castle to something approaching its original condition. Progress was visible. Some rooms regained their period elegance, with restored moldings, refinished floors, and repaired windows. But the project stalled. Two major economic downturns struck in quick succession: the dot-com crash of 2001 and the global financial crisis of 2008. Real estate values fell. Discretionary spending dried up. Restoration is expensive under ideal conditions. In recession, it becomes nearly impossible. Funding evaporated. Crews left. Equipment sat idle. The castle entered a strange liminal state, partially repaired, partially ruined. Some sections looked nearly restored, their sandstone cleaned and windows reglazed. Others remained blackened shells, open to weather, slowly deteriorating further. During this period of incomplete restoration and neglect, reports of aggressive phenomena intensified. Residents and visitors in the 1980s and 1990s described experiences that went beyond sightings and sounds. Helen Merton sometimes spelled Merced in accounts, and her husband moved in during the early 1980s with practical hopes for a normal life. They soon encountered physical attacks. Helen claimed she was pushed down flights of stairs on multiple occasions, not stumbling, not losing balance, but feeling distinct hands on her back shoving her forward. She suffered overwhelming bouts of depression that appeared without cause and lifted the moment she left the property. Items placed on tables reappeared across rooms. The sensation of hostile presences became constant. Not the melancholy sadness attributed to Louise Tiedemann, but something angrier, more determined to drive occupants out. The most disturbing reports came from Helen's husband. He began hearing the unmistakable sound of multiple babies crying from inside the walls. Not faint creaks or pipes, but loud, clear, distressed wails, infants screaming in unison, voices muffled behind plaster and laugh. The cries shifted locations throughout the house. The couple tested the phenomenon. They locked the tape recorder in an empty room, left it running for hours, then played back the tape. They heard babies crying, older children sobbing, and beneath it all, a man's muffled voice shouting in unmistakable anger. The words were indistinct, the tone violent. The Mertons eventually had a child of their own. That decision, more than any single event, convinced them the house was too dangerous. They left, shaken. Helen later told interviewers the phenomena had felt genuinely threatening, not harmless apparitions, but something actively malevolent. The legend of babies crying in the walls became one of Franklin Castle's most disturbing tales. It joined the woman in black, the crying girl in white, the phantom organ music, and the 1975 bones as part of the house's growing mythology. Through fires, economic hardship, and escalating stories of aggression, Franklin Castle endured. Its turrets still rose against the Cleveland sky. Its towers still watched the boulevard. The sandstone still caught light and shadow. Scarred and incomplete, the building stood as a physical echo of all the interrupted dreams and unfinished lives it had contained. The castle had survived deliberate destruction once. It had survived economic abandonment. It had survived the weight of its own reputation. But the question lingered. How long could it continue to stand against both the elements and the forces, real or imagined, that seemed determined to consume it? By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Franklin Castle's reputation had solidified into something far larger than its documented history. The Tiedemann family tragedies, once understood as a heartbreaking string of natural deaths, had been reframed in the public imagination as evidence of something sinister. Hannes Tiedemann, the ambitious immigrant who had risen to wealth and prominence, was no longer simply a grieving father. In whispered conversations, local lore, ghost tour scripts, and sensational media accounts, he had become a suspected murderer. Two figures dominated the emerging murder legends. The first was Karen, sometimes spelled Karen or Karen, described variously as Tiedemann's niece, illegitimate daughter, or mentally unstable relative. According to the story, she was kept hidden in the attic or locked in the tower because of insanity or violent behavior. Eventually, so the tale went, Hannes hanged her from the rafters, either to silence her or to end her suffering. Her ghost, many claimed, became the crying girl in white encountered by the Romano children. The second figure was Rachel, or sometimes Rochelle, portrayed as Tiedemann's mistress or a housemaid. In one version, she was strangled in the tower room during a jealous rage after threatening to expose their affair. In another, she betrayed him with another man. Her spirit supposedly became the woman in black seen standing motionless in upper windows. Additional crimes accumulated around Hannes's name in the telling and retelling, servants who vanished without explanation, business partners who met suspicious ends, even the documented deaths of Emma and Louise reframed as poisonings rather than natural causes. During the late 1970s or early 1980s, a psychic medium who stayed in the castle claimed that Tiedemann appeared to her in dreams night after night, confessing to multiple murders. Her statements caused a minor sensation, though local historians who had worked to place the house on the National Register of Historic Places dismissed them as fantasy. The Victorian Gothic architecture itself helped fertilize these dark stories. The round tower, the gargoyles, the hidden passages, the perpetual half-finished feel of the house, all primed visitors for tales of secrets and violence. Suggestibility played its part too. People entering a location already labeled haunted tend to interpret ambiguous sensations, cold drafts, creaking floors, fleeting shadows, as paranormal. Each retelling added details, sharpened the villainy, and deepened the mystery. Yet beneath the accumulating mythology lay a different reality. In the early 2000s, Cleveland author and investigative historian William G. Krejci undertook years of meticulous research into Franklin Castle and the Tiedemann family. He examined primary sources, death certificates, coroner's reports, cemetery records from Riverside Cemetery, contemporary newspaper obituaries and articles, business ledgers, census data, and surviving family correspondence. His conclusions, published in his book Haunted Franklin Castle, contradicted nearly every murder legend that had grown around the house. The documented deaths were exactly what official records stated. Emma Tiedemann died of diabetes on January 21st, 1881, a terminal diagnosis for a 15-year-old in an era without insulin or effective treatment. The 3 children who died between 1886 and 1888 succumbed to common childhood illnesses of the time: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, or pneumonia. These diseases killed thousands of children annually before modern medicine. Louise Tiedemann died of liver disease in 1895 at age 57. Weep Tiedemann's death was consistent with old age. None of the death certificates, coroner's findings, or newspaper notices indicated foul play, suspicious circumstances, or anything beyond the medical realities of the 1880s. As for Karen and Rachel, Krejci found no historical evidence they ever existed. No birth records, no census entries, no death certificates, no newspaper mentions, no family letters, no probate documents. The alleged murder victims appear to have been complete fabrications, stories that emerged decades after Tiedemann's death, likely invented or exaggerated to heighten the house's macabre appeal. The 1975 bone discovery, long cited as proof of murder, also crumbled under scrutiny. No forensic testing was ever publicly performed. The bones were never preserved or analyzed by professionals. They disappeared from the record shortly after their announcement. Given the timing, during renovations overseen by an owner profiting from ghost tours, the most plausible explanation is that they were planted for publicity. Krejci and other researchers concluded the remains were almost certainly a hoax. Krejci summarizes findings plainly. They were very kind people. Mr. Tiedemann was a benefactor to the community. He was a generous man. He gave often to various charities. He was not the monster that has been made out in all these stories about the castle. There's just no truth to that. The truth, though less sensational, is arguably more poignant. Hannes Tiedemann was an immigrant who worked tirelessly, achieved remarkable success, and supported his community. He built a beautiful home as a symbol of that success. He watched 5 of his children, his mother, and his wife die within its walls over 15 years. The grief was unimaginable. He remodeled obsessively, perhaps hoping to outrun the pain. Ultimately, he sold the house and left because staying had become unbearable. He lived out his final years in quieter surroundings and died peacefully in 1908. That story of ambition, loss, and endurance is tragic enough without the invention of murders. Yet human psychology craves narrative clarity. Random, senseless death is harder to accept than a villain with a motive. A monster who killed his family explains the house's atmosphere better than grief alone. Economic incentives accelerated the process. Ghost tours, books, media appearances, and tourist dollars rewarded the darkest versions of the tale. Franklin Castle thus became a case study in how legends grow. A kernel of truth, genuine family tragedies, is elaborated over decades. Gothic architecture suggests darkness. Suggestible visitors interpret ordinary phenomena as supernatural. Each retelling adds color. Prophet encourages embellishment, and the need for a clear villain overrides mundane reality. The question remains, if the murders never happened, if Tiedemann was simply a grieving father rather than a killer, then why do so many people report feeling something profoundly wrong inside the house? Can accumulated grief imprint itself on a place? Can tragedy alone haunt walls and floorboards? Or is something else at work? Something no historical record can capture? The answer depends on what one is willing to believe. After the 1999 arson fire left Franklin Castle scarred and partially open to the elements, the mansion entered one of its longest periods of uncertainty. Restoration efforts begun by the post-fire owners stalled amid economic recessions. The building existed in a strange half-state. Some rooms painstakingly rebuilt with period-appropriate details, others blackened shells with charred beams and collapsed plaster. Weather crept in through broken windows. Vandals occasionally tested the empty spaces. Yet the castle refused to collapse entirely. Its sandstone walls, laid with such care in the 1880s, continue to hold against time and neglect. In 2011, new owners arrived who approached the property with a different mindset. A European couple, one of them a professional tapestry artist, purchased Franklin Castle and committed to completing the long-delayed restoration. Unlike earlier owners who had either fled in fear, exploited the hauntings for profit, or struggled against financial realities, this pair maintained a deliberate low profile. They did not court media attention. They granted no interviews. They did not invite paranormal investigators or ghost hunting teams. They simply went to work. The restoration focused on architectural fidelity rather than sensationalism. Damaged structural elements were reinforced. Charred wood was replaced with carefully matched timber. The roof was fully repaired and resealed. Windows were reglazed. Interior plasterwork and decorative moldings were recreated where fire had destroyed them. The round tower, its conical roof once partially ruined, was returned to its original sharp silhouette. Stonework was cleaned, revealing again the subtle variations of color and texture that had made the facade so striking in 1883. The couple worked quietly, often over years, investing substantial resources to bring the mansion closer to its Gilded Age appearance. Today, Franklin Castle stands once more as a private residence. The current owners live in a house they have painstakingly revived. They do not open it to the public. No tours pass through its halls. No overnight paranormal investigations take place inside. The building has reclaimed its original purpose, a private home, not a commercial attraction or a curiosity. yet its public notoriety endures. Franklin Boulevard remains a stop on Cleveland ghost tours. Buses and walking groups pause outside the iron fence. Guides point to the round tower, the gargoyles along the eaves, the tall windows that once framed the woman in black. They recount the Tiedemann tragedies. Emma's death before the house was finished, the 3 children lost in quick succession, Louise's final illness. They describe the Romano family's terror, the crying girl in white, the phantom organ music, the priest's warning to leave. They mention the 1975 bone discovery and the legends of murder that followed. The stories are delivered with practiced drama, each retelling polished over decades. Passers-by still stop to stare. The mansion's presence is undeniable. Its scale, its brooding verticality, the way the tower catches the late afternoon light. Even those who know nothing of its history sense that it is not an ordinary house. It commands attention the way a painting or a piece of music can command silence. In 1975, Franklin Castle was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation was based not on its haunted reputation, but on its architectural significance. Designed by Cudell and Richardson at the height of their practice, the mansion exemplifies High Victorian eclectic style. The asymmetry and textured richness of Queen and combined with Gothic verticality and German influences. The rock-faced sandstone, the distinctive round tower, the red brick trim, the gargoyles, all contribute to a building that stands as one of Cleveland's finest surviving examples of Gilded Age residential architecture. The listing protects it from arbitrary demolition or major alteration, ensuring that whatever future changes occur must respect its historic character. More than 140 years after Hannes Tiedemann commissioned its construction, the castle endures on Franklin Boulevard. It has outlasted the deaths that marked its early years, the decades as Eintracht Hall, the exploitation as a haunted attraction, the fires set by human hands, and the long periods of neglect. Its turrets still rise against Cleveland's gray skies. The round tower still watches the street. The sandstone still holds light and shadow in the same patterns that first caught the eye of neighbors in the 1880s. The current owners have given the house something it lacked for many decades: stability and privacy. No new dramatic hauntings have been publicly reported from inside since their stewardship began. No fresh legends have emerged. The building has been allowed to rest, to be simply a home rather than a stage for fear or speculation. Yet the stories persist outside its walls. Tour guides still speak of crying babies in the walls, of invisible hands shoving people downstairs, of a grieving family whose loss is somehow imprinted on the very stones. The contrast is striking. Inside, a quiet, carefully restored residence. Outside, a living legend that refuses to fade. Franklin Castle has become 2 things at once. To its owners, it is a labor of love, a piece of architectural history brought back from the edge of ruin. To the city and to countless visitors, it remains Cleveland's Gothic enigma, a place where history and mystery remain forever entangled. The house no longer needs to speak for itself. Its silence is eloquent enough. More than 140 years after the first stones were laid on Franklin Boulevard, the mansion known as Franklin Castle remains standing, scarred, restored, silent, and still powerfully present. Its round tower pierces a Cleveland sky the way it did in 1883. Its gargoyles still crouch along the eaves, watching the street with stone eyes. Its nearly 80 windows still catch the shifting light, reflecting the boulevard and the lives that pass by. The building has outlived fires, neglect, economic crises, and the changing stories told about it. Yet its deepest significance lies not in what it has survived, but in what it reveals about the people who look at it. At its core, Franklin Castle is a mirror held up to human nature, to how we process tragedy, how we transform grief into legend, and how desperately we seek meaning when loss refuses to make sense. Hannes Tiedemann's story is on the evidence, tragically ordinary in its outline. An immigrant who arrived with little, worked tirelessly, built a successful life, married, raised children, and achieved the visible symbols of American success. Then, in the space of 15 years, he buried his mother, 5 of his children, and his wife. The causes, diabetes, childhood diseases, liver failure, were heartbreaking but medically consistent with the era. No poison, no murder, no hidden victims named Karen or Rachel. The deaths were natural, random, cruel in the way illness can be cruel when medicine has no answer. Yet that truth feels insufficient to many. Random misfortune is hard to accept. It offers no villain, no motive, no explanation that ties the pain into a neat narrative. So the mind reaches for something clearer. A monster, a father who killed his own family, a man who had bodies behind the walls he obsessively rebuilt. Murder provides closure where grief does not. It turns senseless loss into a crime that can, at least in imagination, be solved. It gives the house a reason to feel wrong. The architecture helped the legend grow. High Victorian eclectic design, the asymmetry, the vertical thrust, the round tower, the gargoyles, already carries echoes of Gothic romance and old-world foreboding. People walk past or step inside and feel the weight of the place before any story is told. Suggestibility does the rest. Cold drafts become presences. Creaking floors become footsteps. Fleeting shadows become figures in white or black. Each retelling adds detail. Economic incentives sharpen the edges. Ghost tours, books, media appearances reward the scariest version of events. Over decades, the story outgrows the facts. Franklin Castle also reflects the fragility of the American dream. Hannes Tiedemann embodied the ideal. Hard work, ambition, and opportunity could lift a boy from a Baltic island to wealth and influence. He built a castle to prove it. Yet no amount of money, no architectural grandeur, no personal virtue could shield him from life's indifference. The mansion became not a monument to triumph, but a tomb for hope. Success cannot buy immunity from death. The grandest houses can still fill with grief. The building's survival carries its own lesson. It has endured deliberate arson, 2 major fires, long periods of abandonment, and the relentless wear of time. Owners have come and gone. Grieving families, cultural societies, haunted tour operators, restorers. Some fled, some profited. Some poured money and care into saving it. Through recessions, changing neighborhoods, and shifting tastes, the castle has not been demolished. Its craftsmanship, the deep-laid sandstone, the precise masonry of the tower, the enduring frame, has held. In that endurance lies a quiet defiance. Places outlast the purposes for which they were built. They become palimpsests, layered with every life that has touched them. Today, Franklin Castle is once again a private home. Its European owners have restored it with respect and restraint. They live quietly within its walls. They do not speak publicly about what they feel or do not feel inside. The house no longer needs to perform. It simply exists. Outside, the legend continues. Ghost tours still stop on Franklin Boulevard. Guides still point to the tower and tell of crying children, hidden bones, a priest's warning, a family driven out by unseen forces. Some visitors believe every word. Others come for the thrill of a good story. A few walk away wondering whether a place can absorb sorrow so deeply that it radiates outward for generations. The castle refuses to settle the question. It offers no confession, no absolution, no final proof. The stones keep their silence. That silence may be the truest haunting of all, the refusal to give us the clarity we crave, leaving us to wrestle with ambiguity, to decide for ourselves whether the shadows are memory, imagination, or something more. Franklin Castle stands as a testament to many things. The power of 19th century craftsmanship, the persistence of story over fact, the human need to explain the inexplicable. Above all, it reminds us that grief is not always resolved. Sometimes it lingers, in walls, in family names carved on cemetery stones, in the stories we tell long after the people are gone. The house endures. The questions endure. And perhaps that is the point. Some places do not give answers. They simply bear witness.